The Shadows of Rome, A Courtesan's Tale. Chapter 1. Dawn in a Cramped Cell. The first hint of consciousness was not a gentle awakening, but a slow, reluctant return to a world defined by stone and shadow. Before her eyes even opened, the familiar sense of her existence flooded her senses. The damp, earthy smell of the stone walls that seemed to weep with the city's misery, the lingering aroma of stale wine and cheap, cloying perfume, and the ever-present sour tang of human sweat. This was the perfume of the Sabura, the scent of her life, a fragrance she could never wash away. Her name was Amara, though few who sought her out bothered to use it. She was a body, a brief escape, a name whispered in the dark and forgotten by morning. She lay on a mattress stuffed with straw, its surface lumpy and uneven from countless nights of restless sleep and the weight of anonymous men. The straw pricked at her bare skin through the thin, worn linen of her shift, a constant, irritating reminder of her station. A shiver ran through her, not entirely from the morning chill that seeped through the cracks in the stone, but from the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep had failed to erase. It was a fatigue of the soul. Her room, if one could call it that, was a cella, a cell, and the name was fitting. It was a windowless cube carved out of the lower level of a sprawling insula, one of the towering, precarious apartment blocks that housed Rome's teeming masses. It was barely large enough for her to stretch her arms without touching the cold, weeping walls on either side. This tiny space was her home, her office, and her prison. The only light came from a single sputtering oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space feel even more claustrophobic. Its flame was a tiny, defiant spark against the overwhelming darkness, much like the flicker of life she still felt within herself. She sat up, the straw rustling beneath her. Her possessions were few and humble, tucked into a small alcove carved into the wall. There was a wooden comb with a few teeth missing, a small clay pot of rouge made from red ochre, another of white lead powder to pale her skin, and a shard of polished bronze that served as a mirror. It reflected a distorted, wavering image of her face, a stranger with tired eyes and a story she rarely allowed herself to remember. In the corner stood a clay jug of water and a bucket that served as her chamber pot, a grim reminder of the lack of privacy and basic dignities in her life. Outside her curtained doorway, the sounds of the city were beginning to stir. The distant rumble of wooden carts on the cobblestones, the shouting of vendors setting up their stalls in the nearby market, the muffled arguments and laughter from the other cells lining the narrow corridor. Each sound was a note in the symphony of Rome, a city that was a beast of a million souls, constantly moving, breathing, and demanding. Soon she would hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of the Leno, the brothel owner, his presence a source of constant dread. He never shouted, but his quiet, menacing voice could curdle the blood. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to remain still, to simply exist in the quiet gloom. She thought of the night before, a gruff legionary who smelled of leather and sour wine, his hands rough, his words few. He had paid his 2 asses and left without a backward glance. He was just one in a long, faceless procession. They all blurred together, their desires and their despairs, leaving faint, ghostly imprints on her soul. But there was no time for reflection. The day demanded its due. The Leno expected his cut, and the city expected her performance. She had to prepare, to transform herself from the weary woman who woke in the dark into the alluring creature who could coax coins from the pockets of strangers. With a deep sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 such mornings, she pushed the thin blanket aside and swung her legs onto the cold stone floor. The day had begun. Chapter 2. Rituals of Beauty and Survival. The journey from Amara the woman to Amara the commodity began with water. She poured a small amount from her jug into a shallow clay bowl, the liquid shockingly cold against her skin. She washed her face and hands, the simple act a small ritual of purification, an attempt to wash away the grime and the memory of the previous night. There was no soap, only the abrasive friction of her hands and the hope that it was enough to feel human again, if only for a moment. True cleansing would have to wait for the public baths, the thermae. It was a place of paradoxes, a public space where she could find a moment of private solace, and a place of hygiene that was itself teeming with the city's filth. To get there, she had to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the lupanar and emerge into the chaotic streets. She pulled on a simple, coarse tunic and her worn leather sandals, grabbing a small pouch with a few coins, and her strigil, the curved metal scraper used for cleaning the body. The streets were already a river of humanity. Senators in their pristine white togas, carried on litters by sweating slaves who grunted under the strain, passed by merchants haggling over the price of olives and fish. Children darted through the crowds, their laughter sharp and bright, seemingly immune to the squalor around them. Amara kept her head down, her gaze averted. Here, in the light of day, she was invisible in a different way. Not an object of desire, but something to be ignored, a part of the city's grimy scenery that respectable people pretended not to see. The bathhouse was a grand, echoing structure of marble and steam, a testament to Roman engineering, and a stark contrast to her squalid cell. For a single copper coin, she gained entry to a world of communal nudity and social leveling. Here, the wife of a senator might bathe just a few feet from a common laborer, though they would never acknowledge each other. Amara moved through the various rooms with practiced efficiency, the tepidarium, warm room, to acclimate her body, the caldarium, hot room, where the steam was so thick she could barely see, a welcome anonymity. Here she would sweat out the impurities, and finally begin the scraping. She coated her skin in cheap olive oil, and then, using her strigil, scraped away the mixture of olive oil, sweat, and dirt in long, firm strokes. It was a vigorous, almost violent act of cleansing, as if she could physically remove the taint of her profession. Once clean, she submerged herself in the cool waters of the frigidarium, the shock of the cold a final bracing awakening. She felt a fleeting sense of renewal, of being clean and whole, a feeling she knew would not last beyond the bathhouse doors. Returning to her cell, the second phase of her ritual began, the application of her mask. Sitting before the bronze shard, she began her transformation. First, the white powder, a paste of lead and vinegar, was carefully applied to her face. It felt cool and tight as it dried, creating a pale, almost ghostly complexion that was considered fashionable and alluring. It hid the blemishes, the fatigue, and the sun-darkened reality of her peasant origins. The powder was toxic, slowly poisoning her with each application, but it was the price of the illusion. Next came the rouge. She dipped a finger into the pot of red ochre and applied it to her cheeks and lips, a stark, vibrant splash of color against the white canvas of her face. The color was a signal, a beacon of availability, a promise of passion she rarely felt. Finally, she took a small stick dipped in a mixture of ash and soot and carefully lined her eyes, making them appear larger, darker, and more mysterious. The woman staring back at her from the distorted bronze was no longer Amara. It was a creation, a carefully constructed artifice, designed to entice and to endure. This was the face she would present to the world, a mask of beauty and survival that hid the weary soul beneath. She was ready for business. Chapter 3. The Toga of Shame and Trade. With her face painted into a mask of allure, the final piece of her transformation awaited. It was not a garment of silk or fine linen, but a symbol, a uniform mandated by law and society to set her apart. It was the female toga. For a Roman man, the toga was a mark of citizenship, of status and honor, a flowing testament to his place in the world. For a woman, it was a brand of infamy, a public declaration of her exclusion from respectable society. Respectable Roman matrons, the wives and daughters of citizens, wore the stola, a long modest dress that flowed to their ankles, often secured with ornate brooches. The stola was a symbol of their purity, their devotion to family, and their protected status under the law. By law, Amara and women like her were forbidden from wearing it. Instead, they were condemned to the toga, a garment that screamed their profession to the world. Hers was not the pristine white of a senator, it was made of coarse, cheap wool, dyed a garish, eye-catching yellow with saffron that had long since faded to a sickly mustard color. It was shorter than a man's toga, designed to be revealing rather than stately, and the fabric felt rough and itchy against her skin, a constant physical irritation that mirrored her social one. She took it from a hook on the wall. The weight of it was familiar, a heavy shroud of shame that she had learned to wear like a second skin. As she draped the length of fabric over her shoulder and around her body, she felt the daily shift within herself. The last vestiges of the private Amara receded, and the public persona, the one for sale, took over. The toga was not just clothing, it was a declaration. It said, I am not a wife, I am not a mother, I am not respectable, I am available. She adjusted the folds, ensuring it hung just so, not too neat, lest she look like she was mocking the elite, but not too slovenly, lest she looked desperate. It was a delicate balance learned through painful experience. To complete the look, she adorned herself with cheap jewelry, a string of blue glass beads around her neck, a poor imitation of the lapis lazuli worn by wealthy women, bronze bracelets that clinked together with every movement, an unsubtle announcement of her presence, and small bells tied to her ankles, hidden beneath the toga's hem, their soft jingle intended to draw a man's ear in a crowded street, a sound of invitation in the noisy city. Her hair, which she had painstakingly curled with a heated iron rod, was another signal. Many high-class courtesans wore blonde wigs imported from Gaul to appear exotic, but Amara could not afford such a luxury. Instead, she had lightened her dark hair with a harsh mixture of ash and lye, leaving it brittle and streaked with shades of reddish brown. Looking at her distorted reflection one last time, she saw the complete picture: the pale face, the crimson lips, the dark eyes, the garish toga, the noisy trinkets. She was a walking, talking advertisement for the flesh trade of Rome. The shame that had once burned in her chest had long ago cooled to a numb resignation. This was her armor. This was her cage. With a final deep breath that did little to calm the knot in her stomach, she pushed aside the heavy curtain of her doorway and stepped into the corridor, ready to begin the hunt. Chapter 4: The Hunt for Clients, the Art of Seduction. The lupanar opened directly onto a narrow, bustling alley, a tributary to the great roaring river of Roman life. Stepping outside was like diving into a chaotic sea of sights, sounds, and smells. The air was thick with the aromas of baking bread from a nearby pastrinum, the potent stench of fish sauce, garum from a food stall, and the ever-present odor of unwashed bodies and animal waste. For Amara, this was the marketplace, and she was the merchandise. Her first post of the day was near the entrance to the public baths. Men would emerge from the thermosy clean, relaxed, and often in a good mood, making them more susceptible to suggestion. She stood not directly at the entrance, which would be too aggressive, but slightly down the street, leaning against a wall with a practiced air of casual nonchalance. Her posture was a carefully crafted invitation. One hip jutted out, her head tilted slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing on her painted lips. It was a pose of availability, not of comfort. She did not need to shout. Her appearance did that for her. The bright toga was a beacon. Her eyes did the real work. She had learned to read men in a single glance, a skill essential for survival. She could spot the swaggering soldier, his pay jingling in his purse, looking for a quick and boisterous release. She recognized the nervous young man, barely old enough to grow a beard, his eyes darting around, terrified of being recognized by a family member. She knew the wealthy merchant, his face a mask of public disdain, even as his gaze lingered on her body, looking for a discreet transaction away from the eyes of his peers. "A moment of your time, handsome soldier," she might murmur as one passed, her voice a low, husky purr. "Feeling lonely after your bath?" To the young man, her approach was softer, almost motherly. "Lost, sweet boy? Perhaps I can help you find what you're looking for." Each word was a lure, baited with a different promise. Competition was fierce. Other women, draped in their own colorful togas of lurid green or shocking red, lined the same streets. There was an unspoken code among them, a fragile truce in a daily war. They respected each other's chosen spots, for a time at least. A sharp glance could warn another woman away from a promising client. A shared rolling of the eyes could communicate mutual disgust at a man who tried to haggle for a price lower than a loaf of bread. They were rivals, but they were also sisters in this grim trade, bound by a shared reality that no one else could understand. As the day wore on, she would move her location. The afternoon might find her near the edge of the forum, where lawyers, politicians, and businessmen congregated. Here the game was more subtle. A direct approach was less effective. Instead, it was about catching an eye, holding a gaze for a second too long, and letting the man make the first move. These clients often paid more, but demanded more as well. Conversation, flattery, the illusion of refinement. By evening, as dusk settled and the city's taverns began to fill, she would move to the darker, rowdier alleys of the Sabura. Here the atmosphere was charged with wine and desperation. The marketing became more direct, the negotiations more blunt. She stood in the flickering torchlight of a tavern entrance, her painted face a pale moon in the growing darkness. The men were drunker, louder, and more dangerous. She had to be quicker on her feet, ready to deflect a rough hand or a cruel insult. She walked past a wall covered in graffiti, the ancient form of advertising. Scrawled in charcoal were the names of women and their prices. Felicia for 2 asses, a good time. Further down, she saw her own name, or the name she used here, Amara, the Greek girl, worth every coin. A client must have written it. She wasn't Greek, but the lie made her seem more exotic, more valuable. She felt a flicker of something, not pride, but a grim satisfaction. In a city that tried to render her anonymous, someone had at least remembered her name. Chapter 5: The Price of Pleasure, from a Copper to a Denarius. In Rome, everything had a price, and so did she. Her value was measured not in worth or dignity, but in the cold, hard currency that passed from a man's grimy hand to hers. The negotiation was a grim, familiar dance. It began the moment a potential client's eyes met hers. His gaze would travel over her body, assessing, calculating, as if she were a piece of livestock at the market. For a woman of her standing, working in the lower echelons of the city's flesh trade, the prices were pitifully low. The base rate, the price for a quick, no-frills encounter in her cramped cell, was typically 2 asses. This was the cost of a loaf of cheap bread or a cup of watered-down wine. The thought was a constant bitter pill. Her body, her time, her risk, all valued the same as a common meal. Some men would try to haggle even this paltry sum down to 1, complaining of hard times or a lost wager. Amara had learned to be firm, her voice taking on a hard edge that belied her painted smile. 2 is the price, citizen. Take it or leave it. To show weakness was to invite exploitation. Payment was not always in coin. In a city where poverty was as common as marble, barter was a way of life. A desperate man might offer a small sack of grain, a pair of worn sandals, or a piece of fruit stolen from a market stall. Amara had once accepted a live chicken, which she'd had to kill and cook herself over a small brazier. The smell of roasting meat, a strange and luxurious scent in the grim corridor. More often, men offered promises, a coin tomorrow, a favor next week. These were lies she had learned to spot and refuse. A promise wouldn't buy her food, nor would it satisfy the Leno. This world was a universe away from that of the meretrices, the high-class courtesans who entertained the city's elite. Those women, often educated, skilled in music and conversation, could command prices in silver denarii, sometimes dozens for a single evening. They had luxurious apartments, fine clothes, and the patronage of powerful men. Amara knew of them only through whispers and envious glances at their passing litters. They were stars in a firmament she could never hope to reach. Her world was the mud, not the sky. Her own small attempts at elevating her status were acts of desperate strategy. The lie of being Greek, the carefully practiced accent she would sometimes adopt, could occasionally fetch her an extra coin from a client who fancied himself a connoisseur of the exotic. Any small distinction, any perceived skill beyond the purely physical, could be monetized. It was a constant performance, an exhausting effort to add a sliver of value to a devalued life. And of every coin she earned, a significant portion was not her own. At the end of each day, or sometimes after each client, the Leno, Lucius, would appear, his hand outstretched. He took more than half, his share for providing the cell, the protection, and the privilege of working under his roof. Arguing was pointless. A complaint could earn her a beating or a week without food. The coin she clutched in her hand after he left felt impossibly light, a pathetic remnant of her labor. Each transaction stripped away another layer of her humanity, reducing her to a simple equation of flesh and metal. She was a walking ledger, her body the asset, her soul the uncounted cost. Chapter 6. Within the Walls of the Lupanar. Between she-wolves and overseers. The place Amara called home was known as a lupanar, a name derived from the word lupa, meaning she-wolf. The Romans, with their typical lack of sentimentality, saw the women who worked within as predatory creatures, howling for their prey in the dark alleys of the city. The name was both a descriptor and a condemnation, and the building itself lived up to its grim reputation. It was a two-story stone labyrinth, wedged between a noisy tavern and a crumbling tenement. The ground floor was a dark, narrow hallway, barely wide enough for two people to pass. Off this corridor were the cells, 5 on each side, their doorways covered by heavy, often stained, linen curtains. There were no doors, no locks, no privacy. Every sound, a whispered negotiation, a grunt of effort, a sob of despair, traveled through the thin walls and curtains, creating a constant, unsettling soundtrack to their lives. The air was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies. Cheap incense burned to mask the stench and the ever-present dampness. The walls themselves told a story. They were covered in crude graffiti, a raw and public ledger of the establishment's commerce. Clients had scrawled their own reviews and boasts. I was here with Livia, or Primus is the best, alongside explicit drawings that left nothing to the imagination. The women, too, sometimes added their own marks, a name or a symbol, a tiny act of claiming a piece of this space that otherwise consumed them. Presiding over this grim kingdom was the Leno, Lucius. He was a former soldier, a man whose body had gone to fat, but whose eyes had lost none of their predatory sharpness. He rarely raised his voice, preferring a quiet, menacing tone that promised violence more effectively than any shout. His job was to be the overseer, the parasite who lived off their earnings. He collected his share with an unnerving calm, his thick fingers plucking the coins from their hands. He promised repairs to the leaking roof that never came, and offered protection that was, in reality, a threat. Obey him, or he would not protect them from the dangers of the street or the cruelty of a client. He was an abster, their warden, and their greatest fear. The other she-wolves were a pack of strangers bound by circumstance. There was Livia, a fiery redhead from Gaul, whose sharp tongue got her into as much trouble as it got her out of. There was Prima, older and weary, her face a roadmap of a hard life, who treated the younger girls with a mixture of pity and contempt. And there was little Nona, barely a woman, sold to Lucius by her starving family, her eyes still holding a terrified innocence that the lupanar was slowly eroding day by day. They were competitors, all vying for the same limited pool of coins. A beautiful new girl could mean a lean week for the others. A stolen client could lead to a bitter feud fought with whispers and sabotage. Yet, in the quiet moments, a fragile camaraderie could emerge. They would share a piece of bread, a bit of gossip, or a moment of shared silence, understanding each other's unspoken pain. They would warn a newcomer about a particularly cruel client, or offer a crude remedy for an ailment. It was a sisterhood forged in misery, a flickering candle of humanity in the suffocating darkness of the wolf's den. This was their world, a cage where they were both the bait and the hunted, their lives dictated by the whims of the men who paid and the man who owned them. Chapter 7. The Tavern as a Stage. Wine, Laughter, and Secrets. Not all of Amara's work took place in the bleak confines of the lupanar or the anonymity of the streets. On nights when Lucius decreed it, she was sent to work in a nearby tavern, a Kopanana named the Drunken Goat. If the brothel was a silent prison of stone, the tavern was a chaotic, roaring inferno of noise and humanity. It was a different kind of stage, demanding a different kind of performance. Here she was not just a body for sale. She was a waitress, a flirt, an entertainer, and a confidante. Her role was to move through the smoky, crowded room, pouring watered-down wine from a heavy clay jug into the cups of boisterous soldiers, weary merchants, and shady gamblers. The air was a thick soup of smells, spilled wine, roasting meat, fish sauce, and the sweat of dozens of men packed into a small space. The sound was a constant din of shouting, laughter, the clatter of dice on wooden tables, and the strained notes of a lyre played by a musician in the corner, his music all but drowned out. Her job was to upsell. "Another cup for a strong soldier like you," she'd ask with a practiced smile, her hand lingering on a man's shoulder for a fraction of a second too long. The touch was calculated, promising more than just another drink. For a few extra coins, she would sit with a man, laugh at his crude jokes, and listen to his boasts or his sorrows. She became a temporary therapist, a vessel for the loneliness and frustrations of the city's men. They spoke of cheating wives, bad debts, and dreams of glory. Amara would nod, her eyes wide with feigned interest, all the while calculating how much more she could extract from him before he passed out or his purse ran dry. This work was in some ways more dangerous than her work in the cell. The lines were blurred, a hand would wander, a drunken lunge would need to be dodged with a dancer's grace. She had to be constantly vigilant, her charm a shield against aggression. The tavern keeper, a burly man named Crixus with a scarred face and a perpetually sour expression, offered little protection. He cared only that the wine kept flowing and the coins kept coming. Any trouble she encountered was her own to handle. Yet there were advantages. The pay could be better. A generous drunken patron might tip her more than she would make in 2 encounters at the lupanar. And there was food, scraps of bread, cheese, and sometimes even meat, which she would deftly pocket when no one was looking. But the greatest advantage was information. In the tavern, secrets were spilled as freely as wine. She heard whispers of political intrigue, of merchants' shipping routes, of which legion was due to be paid. This knowledge was a currency of its own, something she could store away, a tiny piece of power in a powerless life. Some of the tavern's back rooms or upstairs chambers were used for more intimate transactions, turning the establishment into a part-time brothel with table service. When a client had enough coin and wine in him, she might lead him away from the noise, up a rickety staircase to a small dusty room. The encounter was often rushed and clumsy, fueled by alcohol and desperation. But afterward she would return to the tavern floor, her smile back in place, ready to pour another cup of wine, her face a perfect mask hiding the exhaustion and disgust that churned within her. Chapter 8. Nymphs of the Street, Freedom and Peril. There were days when the suffocating air of the lupanar and the menacing presence of Lucius became too much to bear. On those days, Amara chose a different path, the path of the freelance prostitute, the prostibuli, who roamed the Roman streets. This was a world without a master, but it was also a world without walls, a life of absolute freedom and absolute peril. To work the streets was to be an independent contractor in the most brutal sense. She set her own hours, she chose her own locations, and most importantly, she kept all the coins she earned. This last part was the siren song that lured women like her into this dangerous game. The thought of an entire day's earnings without Lucius's greedy hand taking its share was a powerful motivator. Her territory was the city itself. She would wander through the crowded marketplaces, her bright toga a splash of color against the drab browns and grays of the common folk. She might linger near the steps of a temple, not a major one like Jupiter's, but a smaller shrine to a lesser god, perhaps Venus, the goddess of love, in a bitter irony. Here she hoped to catch the eye of a man feeling pious, or more likely, a man looking for a distraction from his prayers. The work required a different set of skills. In the lupanar, clients came to her. On the street, she was the hunter. Her approach had to be perfectly calibrated, too bold, and she might attract the attention of the vigiles, the city's watchmen, who could arrest her for public disorder. Too timid, and she would starve. She developed a sixth sense for potential clients, a way of reading a man's posture, the direction of his gaze, the hesitation in his step, a quick smile, a lingering glance, a soft-spoken compliment about his tunic. These were her tools. The transaction itself was often conducted in the shadows of an alleyway, behind a stack of amphorae, or in a rented room in a cheap inn, paid for by the client. The risk was immense. A client could be violent, or he could simply refuse to pay after the act was done. Out here, there was no Crixus or Lucius to appeal to. She was utterly alone. Many streetwalkers carried a small knife tucked into their clothing, a desperate last resort. Amara relied on her wits and her ability to run. She knew the city's labyrinthine alleys better than any mapmaker, and she could disappear into the crowds in a heartbeat. The competition was not just with other women. She competed with anyone selling a moment of pleasure: food vendors, wine sellers, fortune tellers, and even amateur lovers, drunken party girls, or bored wives looking for a thrill. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. Despite the constant fear, there was an undeniable exhilaration to it. On a good day, she could make more in a few hours than she would in a week at the lupanar. The coins in her pouch felt heavier, more real, because they were entirely hers. She could buy a hot meal from a food stall, a small luxury that felt like a feast. She could buy a new ribbon for her hair, or a small vial of scented oil. These were tiny freedoms, but they were precious. As evening fell, the risks multiplied. The streets grew darker, the shadows deeper. This was when the true predators came out. But it was also when the loneliness of the city was at its most acute, and lonely men were her most reliable customers. She would stand at a street corner, a solitary figure illuminated by the flickering light of a distant torch, a nymph of the pavement, selling fleeting moments of warmth in the cold, indifferent heart of Rome. It was a life lived on a knife's edge, but at least for a few hours it was her own. Chapter 9. The Brand and the Tax, under the Aedil's watch. To exist as a prostitute in Rome was to live in a strange paradox, to be both legally recognized and socially condemned. The Roman state, in its relentless pursuit of order and revenue, did not ignore the flesh trade. It regulated it, cataloged it, and taxed it. For Amara, this meant her profession was not just a matter of survival, but a matter of bureaucracy. Once a year, she, like all women who sold their bodies, was required to register with the Aedils, the city magistrates responsible for public buildings, markets, and civic order. The memory of her first time was still a raw wound. Lucius had dragged her and Nona to the public office, a cold, imposing building near the Forum. She had stood before a bored clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers and dead eyes, who took down her name, the one she worked under, her age, and her place of origin. He had scribbled the details onto a wax tablet, his stylus scratching away her anonymity. With that simple act, her name was entered into the official register of prostitutes. This registration conferred upon her the legal status of infamia. It was a brand, an official mark of shame that stripped her of the rights afforded to other Roman citizens. A woman with infamia could not marry a citizen, inherit property in a conventional will, or testify in most courts of law. She was, in the eyes of the state, a person of compromised character, a non-entity in civic life. The law that permitted her to work was the same law that erased her as a person. Some women, particularly those born into slavery within a brothel, bore a more literal brand. Amara had seen them, women with a small, faint tattoo on their upper arm or shoulder, a mark signifying their owner or their status. It was a permanent declaration that they were property, a mark that could never be washed away. And then there was the tax. The Roman state, ever practical, had created the vectigul ex capturis, a tax levied specifically on the earnings of prostitutes. It was a final, bitter irony. The very act for which society scorned her was a source of revenue for the grand aqueducts, the magnificent temples, and the endless wars of the empire. A tax collector, a publicanus who was somehow even more despised than the Leno, would make his rounds, his ledger in hand. He would demand a portion of her earnings, a tax on her shame. Amara hated these encounters more than almost any other. The collector's gaze was cold and clinical, his questions blunt. He didn't see a woman, he saw a column of figures, a source of income for the state. As she handed over the coins she had earned through pain, humiliation, and endless fatigue, she felt a profound sense of futility. She was a cog in the great machine of Rome, her body a resource to be exploited, not just by the men who used her, but by the very empire that held her in contempt. She was licensed to be an outcast, taxed for her own degradation. Chapter 10. Public Scorn and Secret Desires. The greatest paradox of Amara's life was the chasm between public morality and private behavior. Rome, a city that prided itself on virtue, tradition, and family honor, was a city that ran on hypocrisy. The same men who delivered soaring speeches in the Senate about moral decay and the sanctity of the Roman family were often the same men who sought her out in the dead of night. She learned to recognize the faces of power, not from the forum, but from the shadows of her cell. There was the senator, a man whose public image was one of austere dignity, who would arrive at the lupanar with his face cloaked, his voice a nervous whisper as he requested her services. He would speak of his stressful duties, his demanding wife, and his need for a simple, uncomplicated release. In her room, he was just a man, sweaty, fearful, and pathetic. But the next day she might see him in the street, walking with his head held high, surrounded by clients and sycophants, and he would look right through her as if she were nothing more than a piece of filth on the cobblestones. This invisibility was a special kind of pain. To be so intimately known and so publicly denied was a constant assault on her sense of self. The judgment of respectable women, the matrone, was even more direct. They were the guardians of the virtue that Amara supposedly threatened. When she walked through the market, she could feel their eyes on her. Their gazes were like stones, sharp and heavy with contempt. They would pull their children closer, their lips tightening into thin lines of disapproval. They would whisper to one another, their words like wasps buzzing just out of earshot. Amara was the embodiment of their greatest fears, the faithless husband, the lure of vice, the breakdown of the family. They never considered that she was not the cause of their husband's straying, but merely the symptom of a sickness that ran deep in the heart of their society. This public condemnation was echoed by the city's intellectuals. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca penned scathing satires, mocking the painted faces, the garish clothes, and the supposed greed of prostitutes. They used women like Amara as symbols of Rome's decline, lumping them in with gladiators, actors, and other figures of ill repute. Yet their descriptions of brothel life were often so vivid, so filled with specific sordid detail, that it was clear their knowledge was not merely academic. They were condemning a world they knew intimately. Amara learned to build a wall around herself, to let the scorn and the hypocrisy wash over her. She developed a cynical understanding of the human heart, seeing the vast distance between the masks people wore and the desires that festered beneath. The pious man was often the most depraved, the loudest moralist, the most frequent visitor. Her existence was a mirror held up to the city, reflecting a truth that no one wanted to see. She was the secret that everyone kept, the shame that fueled the city's engine of desire, and the living proof of its profound and enduring hypocrisy. Chapter 11. Sickness of Body and Soul. In the world of the lupanar, health was a fragile, fleeting commodity. Sickness was a constant shadow, a predator that stalked the corridors as surely as Lucius did. The Romans had no understanding of germs or viruses. They spoke of bad air, of imbalances in the humors, of divine displeasure. For Amara and the other women, this meant that illness was not just a physical affliction, but a sign of moral or spiritual failing, another layer of shame to bear. The most immediate and terrifying threats were the diseases passed from client to client. Roman texts spoke of ailments that brought persistent itching, painful sores, and foul-smelling discharges, symptoms that could ruin a woman's ability to work, and in a world without effective medicine could lead to a slow, agonizing decline. A woman who showed signs of such a venereal malady was a liability. Luca would confine her to her cell, not out of compassion, but to prevent her from infecting other clients and damaging his business. There were no doctors for women like her. The remedies were a desperate collection of folk wisdom and superstition. Prima, the oldest of the women, would prescribe washes of strong vinegar, poultices made of crushed herbs, or desperate prayers to Venus Verticordia, the aspect of the goddess who was supposed to turn hearts from vice to virtue. These treatments rarely worked. More often the sickness would run its course, leaving the woman scarred, weakened, and less desirable to clients. Beyond these specific dangers were the everyday ailments of poverty, the hacking coughs that echoed through the damp corridors in winter, the fevers that swept through the crowded city in the summer heat, the skin infections from the constant filth. A simple cut could fester and turn deadly. Food was often scarce and of poor quality, leaving them perpetually malnourished and vulnerable. But the sicknesses of the body were often easier to bear than the sicknesses of the soul. The work took a toll that no herbal remedy could touch. To survive, Amara had learned to disconnect her mind from her body. During an encounter, she would retreat to a silent, walled-off place within herself, a mental sanctuary where the grunts and smells and rough hands of the man using her could not reach. She would think of the sea, which she had seen only once as a child, or the smell of rain on dry earth. This dissociation was a necessary survival mechanism, but it left her feeling fractured, as if she were a ghost haunting her own skin. She saw the toll on the other women. Livia's fiery temper was a shield against a deep-seated fear. Prima's cynicism was a wall built over years of heartbreak and disappointment. And little Nona, who had arrived with such terror in her eyes, was growing quieter, her gaze becoming more distant with each passing week. Sometimes, at night, Amara would hear her weeping softly behind her curtain, a sound that was almost worse than silence. They all suffered from a profound and unnamed sadness, a trauma that had no word in the Roman lexicon. They had wine, and sometimes, if a client was generous, a bit of opium to dull the pain, but these were temporary escapes. The sickness of the soul was a chronic condition, a fever that never broke. Chapter 12, Pregnancy, Between Choice and Doom. For the women of the Lupanar, the monthly arrival of their blood was a cause for quiet, desperate relief. Its absence, however, was a harbinger of absolute terror. Pregnancy was the ultimate occupational hazard, a biological reality that threatened to shatter their already precarious existence. In a world without reliable contraception, the women relied on a desperate and often ineffective arsenal of methods passed down through generations. They used crude barrier methods, such as sponges soaked in vinegar or wads of wool coated in honey, inserted before an encounter. They drank bitter herbal concoctions made from plants like Queen Anne's lace or pennyroyal, which were believed to prevent conception or induce a miscarriage. The most famous contraceptive, the plant silphium, was so sought after that it had been harvested to extinction centuries before, a testament to the ancient and desperate human desire for control over fertility. These methods were a gamble, their effectiveness a matter of luck and faith. When these measures failed and a woman's belly began to swell, she faced a series of impossible choices. Lucius viewed a pregnant prostitute as damaged goods, a broken tool. He would berate her, cut her rations, and pressure her to get rid of the problem. Some women, in their desperation, would seek out back alley healers who performed dangerous and often fatal abortions using sharp instruments or violent massages. The risk of bleeding to death or dying from a subsequent infection was immense. If a woman chose to carry the child to term, her life became even more difficult. She would continue working for as long as she could, hiding her growing belly under the loose folds of her toga. But eventually, she would be unable to attract clients, her income vanishing entirely. Lucius might allow her to stay, but she would be little more than a servant, performing menial chores in exchange for a roof over her head. The birth itself was a perilous affair, often taking place in the same filthy cell where she worked, attended only by the other women. The chances of both mother and child surviving were slim, and if the baby was born healthy, a new and terrible choice presented itself. What was the fate of a child born in a brothel? Some women tried to raise their children within the walls of the lupanar. A baby's cry would become another sound in the grim symphony of the place. The child would grow up surrounded by the harsh realities of the trade, its innocence a fragile flame in a world of darkness. But this was rare. More often, the infant was abandoned. The mother, her heart a stone in her chest, would wrap the baby in a piece of cloth and leave it on the steps of a temple or at a public monument, a practice grimly accepted by Roman society. These foundlings might be taken in by a childless couple, or more likely, they would be picked up by slave traders. A baby girl, in a cruel twist of fate, might one day find herself working in the same profession as the mother who had abandoned her. The most horrifying choice was infanticide. It was illegal, but in the desperate hidden world of the Sabura, the law was a distant concern. A mother, seeing no other way out, might quietly end her infant's life, a final tragic act of mercy or despair. For Amara, the fear of this choice was a constant gnawing presence. Every month she prayed to the gods she wasn't sure she believed in, prayed for the flow of blood that meant she had been spared, for one more month from the ultimate impossible choice. Chapter 13, Gods and Superstitions, Prayers in the Dark. In a life governed by chance and the whims of others, faith was a desperate anchor. The grand gods of the Roman state, Jupiter, Juno, Mars felt distant and imposing, deities for senators and generals, not for women like Amara. Her prayers were smaller, more personal, whispered in the darkness of her cell to the gods of the common folk, the spirits of the crossroads, and the patrons of her perilous trade. In a small soot-stained alcove in her wall, she kept a tiny makeshift altar. On it sat a small, crudely carved wooden figure of Venus, not the majestic goddess of love and beauty, but Venus Cloacina, the purifier, the goddess of the sewers, a deity who understood filth and the need for cleansing. Before this humble effigy, Amara would leave small offerings, a single flower stolen from a rich woman's garden, a drop of wine from her meager ration, or simply a whispered plea for a kind client, a painless night, and enough coins to eat the next day. Her primary deity, however, was Fortuna, the fickle goddess of luck. Every woman in the lupanar paid homage to Fortuna. Life was a constant roll of the dice. Would the next client be gentle or cruel? Would she earn enough to satisfy Lucius? Would she avoid sickness for another week? Amara wore a small, worn bronze charm of a wheel around her neck, a constant reminder of Fortuna's ever-turning nature. Before stepping out of the lupanar, she would press it to her lips, a silent prayer for the wheel to turn in her favor, just for today. But her spiritual life was not confined to the gods. It was a tangled web of superstition and folk magic, a desperate attempt to exert some control over an uncontrollable world. She tied a thin red cord around her ankle, a charm believed to ward off the malus oculus, the evil eye, whose envious glance could bring sickness or misfortune. She avoided stepping on certain cracks in the cobblestones and spat 3 times to ward off a bad omen if a black cat crossed her path. This world of belief had a darker side as well. When rivalry flared between the women, it sometimes escalated into magical warfare. Amara had once found a defixa, a curse tablet, tucked under her mattress. It was a small, thin sheet of lead, inscribed with a hateful message scratched in crude letters. May Amara's tongue rot, may her limbs grow weak, may no man desire her. The curse had been written by Livia, the fiery Gaul, after Amara had caught the eye of a wealthy regular. Terrified, Amara had taken the tablet to a back-alley witch, a crone who for a steep price performed a counter-ritual involving burning foul-smelling herbs and chanting in an unknown tongue. Whether it worked or not, Amara couldn't say, but the fear it instilled was real. In a world where they had no legal recourse, a curse was a weapon, a way to inflict harm when physical violence was too risky. These rituals, prayers, and superstitions were more than just beliefs. They were tools of survival. They provided a framework for understanding suffering, a sliver of hope in the face of overwhelming despair, and a fragile sense of agency in a life that offered almost none. Chapter 14: The Illusion of Love in a World for Sale. Of all the dangers Amara faced, violence, disease, poverty, the most insidious was the illusion of love. It was a poison offered in a golden cup, a fantasy that could shatter a woman's defenses more completely than any physical blow. Clients fell in love, or claimed to, with a predictable regularity. It usually happened after the third cup of wine, when the harsh realities of their own lives began to soften at the edges. A lonely merchant, a homesick soldier, a frustrated husband, they would look at her, their eyes filled with a maudlin sentimentality, and see not a prostitute, but a savior, a confidante, the one woman who truly understood them. "You're not like the others, Amara," a man might whisper, his hand clutching hers with a desperate sincerity. "You have a gentle soul. If only I had met you before, I would take you away from all this." In her early days, these words had been a balm to her wounded spirit. She had clung to them, allowing herself to dream of a different life, a small house with a garden, the safety of a husband's protection, the dignity of being a wife. She had learned, through bitter experience, that these were almost always lies. The promises evaporated with the morning sun, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of her cell. The man who had sworn his undying devotion one night would ignore her in the street the next day, his face a mask of indifference. She had built a fortress of cynicism around her heart. She learned to smile, to nod, to play the part of the adoring listener, all while her mind remained cold and detached. His professions of love were just part of the transaction, an emotional currency he paid for the illusion of intimacy. She would accept his compliments as she accepted his coins, knowing that both were fleeting. Yet even this fortress was not impregnable. There were regulars, men who came back week after week. One, a quiet stonemason named Marcus, was different. He was gentle and respectful. He never got drunk. He would bring her small gifts, a smooth stone from the river, a piece of sweet fruit. He spoke to her not of his own troubles, but of her. He asked about her life before Rome, and he listened, truly listened to her answers. With him, Amara found herself letting her guard down. She would laugh a real laugh, not the practiced one she used on others. She began to look forward to his visits, a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. This was the true peril. To feel something, to hope for something, was to make herself vulnerable. The law was clear. Her infamia meant she could never legally marry a citizen like Marcus. Any life they might build together would be in the shadows, without legal protection or social acceptance. And what if he tired of her? What if he found a respectable woman to marry? The fall from that height of hope would be devastating. She saw the wreckage of such illusions all around her. Prima had once been the favorite of a wealthy equestrian who had promised her freedom and a life of ease. He had kept her for a year, then discarded her for a younger woman, leaving Prima with nothing but a broken heart and a deeper bitterness. Love, Amara concluded, was the most dangerous commodity in the lupanar. It promised everything and delivered only pain. It was a luxury she could not afford, an illusion that could cost her the one thing she had left, her will to survive. Chapter 15, Sisterhood of the Enslaved. Friendship behind the curtain. In the suffocating confines of the lupanar, the other women were not friends, not in the way the world outside understood the term. They were mirrors, reflecting Amara's own fears and occasional triumphs. They were rivals, their livelihoods depending on catching the same fleeting glances from the same passing men. And yet, in the crucible of their shared existence, a strange and powerful bond was forged, a sisterhood of the enslaved, a friendship that existed only behind the curtain. Their interactions were a complex dance of sharp edges and soft moments. Livia, the Gaul with hair like fire, was a tempest of moods. She would hiss a threat at Amara for lingering too long with a potential client, her eyes flashing with competitive fury. But later that same night, when a drunken senator became too rough with little Nona, it was Livia who burst through the curtain, her voice a thunderclap that sent the powerful man scurrying away in shame and fear. Her anger was a shield, not just for herself, but for the fragile pack she reluctantly belonged to. Prima, the oldest, was their repository of weary knowledge. Her cynicism was as thick as the grime on the walls, but it was a practical cynicism. When Amara felt a fever coming on, it was Prima who brewed a bitter, foul-tasting tea that miraculously seemed to help. When Nona despaired, Prima would not offer soft words, but a harsh truth. Tears don't buy bread. Harden your heart, or this place will break it. Her advice was never kind, but it was always true, a bitter medicine for a bitter life. Amara found her own place in this fractured family. She was the quiet one, the observer. She mediated the frequent squabbles between Livia and the others, her calm presence a small island in their sea of turmoil. She would listen to Prima's endless stories of a life before the lupanar, a life that seemed as distant as a myth, and she took Nona under her wing, teaching her the subtle arts of survival, how to read a client's intentions, how to hide a coin from Lucius, how to build that necessary wall inside her mind. The moments of true connection were small and stolen, huddled together in the corridor during a slow afternoon, sharing a piece of cheese one of them had managed to acquire, a rare, genuine laugh when a particularly arrogant client tripped on his own toga. The silent, knowing glance exchanged over the heads of drunken men in the tavern. These were the threads that wove them together. They knew each other's deepest shames and smallest hopes. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, sick, heartbroken, terrified. No one else in the vast city of Rome could ever understand what it was to be them. This bond was their only true defense. Lucius could beat them, clients could use them, and society could scorn them, but they could not completely break the invisible ties that bound the women of the Lupanar. It was not love, and it was not always kindness, but it was a fierce, shared will to endure. In the darkness behind the curtain, they were not just lupe, she-wolves, howling alone. They were a pack. Chapter 16. When Beauty Fades. The Courtesan's Future. The most persistent fear in Amara's life was not the threat of violence or disease, but the slow, inexorable march of time. In her profession, youth and beauty were not just assets, they were the entirety of her currency. Every day she would scrutinize her reflection in the warped bronze mirror, searching for the first signs of decay, a new line at the corner of her eye, a slight slackening of her jaw, a strand of gray in her lie-damaged hair. Each discovery was a small death, a harbinger of a terrifying future. Her glimpse into that future was Prima. The older woman was a living ghost of what was to come. Amara watched as Prima's clientele dwindled and changed. The younger, wealthier men no longer sought her out. Instead, she was left with the dregs, the very old, the very poor, the drunkards too incoherent to care about a youthful face. Her price had fallen to a single as, and sometimes she worked for nothing more than a cup of wine or a piece of stale bread. Lucius treated her with open contempt, his menacing quiet replaced by loud, humiliating insults. Her body, once her tool, was now her tormentor, her joints aching with a persistent dull pain that wine could no longer soothe. Amara looked at Prima and saw herself in 20 years. The thought filled her with a cold, paralyzing dread. What would become of her when her own beauty faded? The paths available to an aging prostitute were few, and all were grim. The best she could hope for, the dream that every woman in the Lupanar secretly nurtured, was to save enough money to buy her freedom if she were a slave, and perhaps open her own establishment. To become a Lena, a madam, was to trade one form of servitude for another, but it was a position of power. Elena had a roof over her head and food in her belly, but saving money was nearly impossible. Between Lucius's cut, the taxes, and the simple cost of survival, her coins vanished as quickly as she earned them. Another path was to find a wealthy patron who would keep her as a mistress into her old age. But this was a fantasy, a story from a Greek play. Roman men valued youth above all else. An older mistress was an object of ridicule. The most likely future was far bleaker. She would be forced to work in the lowest dives, the filthiest taverns at the edge of the city, catering to the most dangerous and desperate clients for mere scraps. When she could no longer do even that, she would be cast out. She saw these women every day on the streets of Rome, toothless, ragged crones, their faces ravaged by time and disease, begging for alms at the temple gates, their hands outstretched, their eyes empty. They were the ghosts of her profession, a silent, terrifying warning of the fate that awaited those who could not escape. This fear was a constant spur. It drove her to take risks, to work longer hours, to endure more humiliation, all in the desperate hope of stashing away one extra coin. Every as she managed to hide from Lucius was a tiny brick in a wall she was trying to build against the future, a flimsy defense against the encroaching tide of age and irrelevance. But she knew, in the deepest part of her soul, that the wall was not high enough. Time was the one client she could never bargain with, the one master she could never escape. Chapter 17. From Courtesan to Matron, a New Path. The dream of becoming Alina was the most potent fantasy whispered in the corridors of the Lupinar. It was the only conceivable form of retirement, the only path that offered a sliver of autonomy and a reprieve from the nightly degradation of selling one's own flesh. To ascend from being one of the she-wolves to being the keeper of the den was a transformation that required more than just luck. It required a ruthless cunning, an iron will, and a hoard of secretly saved coins that seemed impossibly large. Amara knew of only one woman who had made this leap. Her name was Gaia, and she had once worked in this very Lupinar years ago, before Prima's time. Now she owned a small but prosperous establishment near the docks, a place known for its clean rooms and disciplined girls. The women spoke of Gaia with a mixture of awe and fear. She was proof that escape was possible, but she was also a cautionary tale. Gaia, they said, had been relentlessly frugal. While other women spent their meager earnings on a bit of extra wine or a new ribbon, Gaia had subsisted on scraps, hoarding every spare coin. She had cultivated a long-term relationship with a single, wealthy client, a shipping merchant, who upon his death had left her a small, unofficial inheritance. It was a one-in-a-million chance, a perfect alignment of Fortuna's wheel. With this capital, Gaia had purchased a small building and a handful of slave girls. Amara had seen her once at the market, a stout, formidable woman with shrewd, calculating eyes and hands adorned with rings. She no longer wore the garish toga of her former trade. Instead, she was draped in the dark, respectable robes of a business owner. She had traded her own body for the bodies of others, and in doing so had become a mirror image of Lucius. The life of Elena was a strange and bitter form of freedom. Gaia no longer had to endure the touch of unwanted men. She slept in a real bed, in a private room with a door that locked. She ate well and commanded a grudging respect from the local merchants. But her days were now consumed with the grim mathematics of the flesh trade. She had to manage her stock, ensuring her girls were healthy enough to work but not so well fed that they became lazy. She had to deal with the Adalos, the tax collectors, and the violent drunken clients. She had become the warden of the very same cage she had so desperately escaped. Was this freedom? Amara often wondered. Or was it simply a higher, more comfortable rung on the same ladder of exploitation? To achieve this status, Gaia had to become as hard and unforgiving as the men who had once owned her. She had to look at a terrified new girl like Nona and see not a soul but an investment. She had to collect her share of the earnings with the same cold indifference that Lucius showed them. The path to becoming a matron was paved with the last vestiges of one's own compassion. It was a victory of a sort, but it was a victory that required the death of the heart. For Amara, the dream of becoming Elena was both a beacon of hope and a terrifying prospect, a choice between being the victim and becoming the victimizer. Chapter 18. Forgotten Fates. Old Age on the Fringes. For every Gaia who clawed her way to the position of Lena, there were 100 Primas who simply faded away, their light extinguished by time and indifference. The story of Prima was the one that haunted Amara's waking moments and stalked her dreams, for it was not a story, but a prophecy, the most likely telling of her own final chapter. The decline was slow, then terrifyingly fast. For years, Prima had been a fixture of the Lupinar, her sharp wit and experience making up for her fading looks. But time was a relentless creditor. The lead-based makeup she had used for decades had seeped into her skin, leaving it sallow and gray. Her teeth, neglected and rotten, ached constantly. The youthful plumpness of her figure had given way to a gaunt thinness, and her hands were gnarled with the pain of her joints. Lucius, who had once valued her as a reliable earner, now saw her as dead weight. His insults became more frequent and more cruel. "Look at you, you old crow," he would sneer when she failed to attract a client. "You're scaring away the customers. You cost me more in bread than you earn." The day finally came when Lucius cast her out. There was no ceremony, no final payment. He simply threw her few belongings into the alley and barred the curtained entrance to her. "Don't come back," was all he said. Prima, who had given decades of her life and her body to that place, was suddenly homeless, penniless, and alone. Amara and the other women watched from the shadows of the corridor, their hearts cold with fear. They had secretly pressed a few coins into Prima's hand, a pitifully small gesture against the vastness of her predicament. They watched as she stumbled down the alley, a stooped, broken figure disappearing into the indifferent crowds of Rome. After that, Amara would see her from time to time, a ghost haunting the edges of the city. Prima had joined the ranks of the forgotten, the human refuse that littered the magnificent capital. She would huddle near the temple of Saturn, her hand outstretched, her voice a cracked whisper as she begged for a single ass. The vibrant makeup was gone, replaced by a layer of grime. Her toga was a tattered, colorless rag. Most people walked past without a second glance. She was invisible, a non-person. Once, Amara saw a group of young boys throwing stones at her, laughing at the old witch. Amara wanted to scream, to run to her, to tell them that this woman had once been desired, that she had a name, a story, but she stayed hidden in the shadows, paralyzed by fear. To associate with Prima was to be tainted by her failure, to acknowledge the future that awaited them all. Seeing Prima was a constant, visceral reminder of the stakes. Every coin Amara earned, every humiliation she endured, was part of a desperate race against her own body's betrayal. The image of Prima's empty eyes and trembling hand was burned into her mind. It was the face of failure, the face of obsolescence, the face of a woman consumed and then discarded by the city she had served. It was the face of her own future if Fortuna's wheel did not turn, and turn soon. Chapter 19: Echoes on the Walls, a Legacy in Graffiti. The great men of Rome built their legacies in marble and bronze. Their victories were carved into triumphal arches, their laws inscribed on stone tablets, their faces stamped onto coins that would outlast their flesh by millennia. They wrote their history in epic poems and flowing prose, ensuring their names would echo through eternity. Amara and the women of the Lupanar had no such monuments. Their history was not written in stone, but scratched into plaster. Their legacy was graffiti. On slow, quiet nights, when the corridor was empty and the city's roar had softened to a distant hum, Amara would sometimes trace the markings on the walls of her cell and the hallway outside. They were a chaotic, layered tapestry of human experience, a testament to the thousands of fleeting moments that had taken place within these walls. Each scratch was a ghost, a whisper from the past. There were the boastful declarations of men. Gas was here and conquered, next to a crude phallus. There were the satisfied reviews, the ancient equivalent of a recommendation. Spend your coin on Livia. She knows what she's doing. And there were the complaints. Fortunatus is a thief. He stole my purse. These were the voices of the clients, loud, crude, and self-important. But woven between them were other, fainter marks. The names of women, written in their own hands. Nona, Prima, Livia, Amara. It was a small act of defiance, a declaration that they existed, that they had names beyond the generic term lupa. It was a way of saying, I was here, I survived this place. Amara would run her fingers over the letters of her own name, a name she had chosen for this life. It felt more real here, etched into the wall, than it did when it was whispered by a client in the dark. Some of the graffiti was heartbreakingly simple, a series of vertical lines scratched into the corner of a cell, a silent calendar marking the days, or perhaps the number of clients a woman had endured. A small, crudely drawn flower next to a name, a tiny, desperate attempt to bring a touch of beauty into the ugliness. These were the secret histories, the stories no one else would ever read or understand. This was their only monument. While emperors built forums, these women left their mark on the crumbling walls of their prison. Their stories were not of conquests and glory, but of survival, commerce, and fleeting human connection. The graffiti was a raw, honest, and ephemeral history, a new layer of plaster, a fire, or the simple passage of time could erase it forever. Yet, for as long as it remained, it was a testament. It proved that behind the grand facade of Rome, in the darkest alleys and the meanest rooms, there were lives being lived, names being remembered, and stories being told, one desperate scratch at a time. It was a legacy of shadows, but it was a legacy nonetheless. Chapter 20: Shadows of the Eternal City, an Unspoken History. The sun was setting over the 7 hills of Rome, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. From a high window in the tavern, Amara could see the silhouette of the city, a breathtaking vista of marble temples, grand basilicas, and the distant colossal form of the Colosseum. It was the heart of the world, a city that believed itself to be eternal, a beacon of civilization and power, and she, Amara, was one of its shadows. For every gleaming temple, there was a dark, filthy alley. For every triumphant general, there were 1,000 forgotten soldiers. And for every virtuous Matrona, there was a woman like her, a necessary and despised part of the city's complex machinery. Rome, she had come to understand, could not exist without its shadows. The light of its glory required the darkness of its underbelly. The virtue of its elite was defined against the infamia of its outcasts. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in the city years ago. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but it was now accompanied by a hard-won resilience, a cynical wisdom that was its own form of strength. She had survived. She had endured the cruelty of Lucius, the hypocrisy of the senators, the pain of her own body, and the slow erosion of her soul. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the city, to find moments of grace in the midst of squalor, to build a fragile family out of broken pieces. Her future was still a terrifying, formless void. Perhaps she would end up like Prima, a beggar on the street. Perhaps, by some miracle of fortuna, she would save enough to buy a small tavern of her own and become a Gaia, trading one form of cruelty for another. Or perhaps she would simply continue, day after day, until her body finally gave out. She did not know, but as she looked out at the eternal city, a strange sense of peace settled over her. She was a part of this place. Her sweat, her tears, and her blood were mixed with the mortar of its foundations. The coins she had earned had helped pay for the soldiers who defended its borders and the grain that fed its people. Her story would never be written in the official histories. Her name would not be remembered by the poets. But she was here. She had lived. She turned away from the window, her face settling back into the familiar painted mask of her trade. A new client was waiting downstairs. The night was young, and there were coins to be made. She was Amara. She was a shadow of Rome. And in the heart of the eternal city, the shadows too were eternal.